I want to start by actually just doing a quick grounding activity. If you're anything like me, you've probably been running around this morning trying to do a million things and trying to be present at this conference while also checking email and responding to other things that are going on in your life or in your work. So, and I also, especially when we're on Zoom and like staring into these little boxes, I feel like it's important to ground ourselves in the space that we're in. So I'd encourage you all to just take a moment and slow down, stop whatever you're doing. If you're standing, that's fine. You can sit down if you like, or you can remain standing. And we're just going to start by just focusing on the breath. So just breathe naturally in and out, and really try to focus your awareness on that breath going in, down into your lungs, and then out. You can close your eyes if you want to, or you can keep them open. You'll have to open them for the next part of this anyways, but we'll just do a couple more breaths. And so this is just a quick activity to orient ourselves to our space that we're in. So the first thing to do is just turn your head and slowly look around in all directions around you in your room. And that includes behind you. Make sure you check out whatever's behind you. And if you're indoors, notice the height of the ceiling, kind of how big the space is, how far away the walls might be from you, the height and color of the walls. If there are any windows or doors or other details in your space around you that stand out. And if you're outside, take note of any boundaries, such as a fence or a path or a street. Any beings that you're sharing your space with, whether that's houseplants or trees and sparrows outside. And notice what sounds you hear. Focus on if there are any smells that are sticking out to you in your environment. And kind of what the temperature and feel of your space is. And finally, kind of take one final look around. Again, getting the dimensions of the space, and making sure to look behind you again as well. Make sure that you're oriented and grounded in your space and in your room. Cool. Thanks for joining me in that. That helps me feel a little more settled. I think it's important when we're starting having conversations about inclusivity, about things like race or gender and identity that might be somewhat charged, that might bring up discomfort. Starting from a place of really having an awareness of our surroundings and feeling grounded in our body, I think is a really important piece for myself. The other piece that I think is really important, and this is going to be the next thing that we do, is getting to know one another a little bit, is getting grounded in our relationship to one another and introducing ourselves not just to our space, but to someone else. And this is harder on Zoom than it is in a real live environment. But my goal for this next piece is I'm going to model this first, and then we're going to break out into pairs, and each of you is going to have a chance to introduce yourself to someone else. So we do this in our instructor training. It's kind of a fun way to introduce yourself. We call it a 2-minute bio. basically you have 2 minutes uninterrupted to tell your life story, basically. And 2 minutes is not a long time. So the fun part about it is that you kind of never know what's going to come out, and what's going to be the part of your identity and experience that really comes to the fore. So I'm going to ask people to share your name, share your pronouns, if that's something you're comfortable with, and the place that your place, and that could be the indigenous lands that you're on, that could be the current name of that place, that could be your hometown. So something about your place, and then you'll have the rest of the 2 minutes to tell whatever piece you want to, about your work, about who you are, about your experience in your life. So like I said, I'm going to model this real quick. So timer is starting right now. Yeah, hi, my name is Alexei Desmarais. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm calling today from the traditional homelands of the Ktunaxa, Salish, and Kalispel peoples, among many others. And I originally grew up in Colorado, in the West Elk Mountains, traditional Ute territory. But I traveled all over the world when I was growing up, and just had an incredible amount of opportunities to see different cultures, different landscapes, different ecologies, and filled journals with drawings of birds and other wildlife, and yeah, had a really deep love and appreciation for being outdoors, and feel immensely lucky and privileged to have had those experiences as well. I kind of left that behind a little bit in high school, and tried to be cool and play sports, and it wasn't as cool to be into animals and the outdoors. And then ended up studying philosophy in my undergrad, and got really into the academic side of things. But I ended up coming back around to environmental education, and first started working with some immigrant students, mostly coming from East African countries in Seattle, and supporting them in creating environmental initiatives in their schools and communities in Seattle. Yeah, I have 20 seconds to finish this up. So the last thing that I'll say, I guess, is that, yeah, so now I currently work at Ecology Project International. I manage our programs out in Yellowstone, where we take students from around the country, but specifically Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho is our focus, out into the field for a week to do field research with park biologists. And that's a little over. So you get the general gist. There's all sorts of things you can say in this. Again, I ask that you start with your place, your name, place, and pronouns. So Rebecca, if you could break us out into pairs, and I will give you the 2 minute warning that lets you know it's time to switch. And then after both of you have had 2 minutes to share, we'll come back to the group. Sound good?
Okay, we have 42-ish people. I'm gonna make 21 breakout rooms.
Perfect.
This is gonna be an experiment, so I apologize if this doesn't go great. We'll pivot if it doesn't. Okay, I'm gonna assign you all automatically. You might meet a new person in a minute or so. Okay. Lori and Rose, I already know you. This is great though.
Hi.
Hi there. So I am going to have you start, Rose. Go ahead and introduce yourself.
Oh, hold on. I've got two computers going here, so I've got two sessions.
Awesome. Are we all back, Rebecca? Great. Well, thanks for that. I hope you learned something about someone else. I know we don't have a lot of time here today together, so I do want to dive into this a little bit, but I think this just kind of illustrates one of my foundational principles when I'm thinking about inclusive teaching, and specifically when I'm trying to model this when we're working with instructors on being inclusive teachers, which is that starting with relationships and rapport and treating our students as more than just these vessels that we want to fill with knowledge is one of the most important foundations of creating an inclusive course or a classroom environment where students are really going to learn and feel comfortable and safe bringing their whole selves into it. So I appreciate you all hanging with me as we kind of slowly get into this topic. But yeah, so we're going to spend the next 35-40 minutes or so talking about and looking at some of the pieces of how we train our instructional staff in EPI's Yellowstone program in working towards becoming inclusive educators. And again, as I said, I think that inclusive instruction is really the foundation of all learning, because students aren't going to be able to learn, and instructors also aren't going to be able to teach effectively if folks don't feel safe in that space and don't feel comfortable being vulnerable and opening themselves up and putting themselves out there. And so this is really one of those foundational pieces. And some of this will be me kind of modeling things like I just did in the beginning there. Some of it will be us going through some of the steps that we would actually do in the instructor training and having some meta conversations about why we do those specific pieces. And then at the end, I'm going to share just kind of quickly some tools and walk through very quickly some of the other things that we do and use in this training, which is normally at least 3 hours. So and even that is not nearly enough time. But I think for the purposes of this conversation and also when we talk about inclusivity training with our instructors, this isn't a conversation about like trying to prove how woke we are or like how much we know and how much jargon we can throw around equity, inclusion, diversity, all of those sort of terms. It's really about creating a space for an honest conversation and recognizing that we're all at different places in our journeys, and we're all responsible and accountable for this work. And so it's about taking that step forward for yourself today, whatever that looks like, wherever you're at, and starting to build a culture and a conversation and a shared language around inclusivity within our program, as well as within the course environment that instructors are in charge of. And yeah, so one of the other things that we do at the outset is, and I'm sure most of you are familiar with this, is creating some group agreements. And so normally with instructors, we would co-create these so that there's some real ownership over these agreements. And these are expectations that we have for how we're going to share this space together today. And I really like to use these to go back to them if we do come into some conflict or there's some discomfort or a charged moment, to return to these, to return to our shared desire to make environmental education a more inclusive field and to make sure that our programs are an inclusive space for all students. And to ground ourselves in those values and in these agreements. So these are a few that I like. And generally I would pick like 5 or so that it's not super overwhelming. But I'll just go through them really quickly. So being present, I recognize this looks different for everyone. Some people it's eye contact and nodding along and that like active sort of listening. For some of us, especially on Zoom, we might have other things going on in our environment. So that engagement might look a little bit different if we need to let the dog out or go grab a drink of water or something like that. So taking care of your needs is one of the pieces of being present. Another piece of being present here and engaged is really being present in the body and noticing when we meet resistance or discomfort in some of these conversations about inclusivity and identity. And for me, that's often like my breathing gets shallow or even stops, or I'll have like a sudden pain somewhere. It looks different for everyone, but noticing that and trying to parse discomfort from safety, from feeling unsafe, because there is a tendency in white dominant cultural spaces to really numb discomfort. And to protect white supremacy by not getting into uncomfortable conversations. And so discomfort is really an important part of this process. It's necessary for growth, it's necessary for learning. And so we're trying to create a container where we can hold that discomfort and we can get curious about it rather than running away from it. Cultural and intellectual humility. Basically, this just means coming in with an open mind. Recognizing that all of us have identities and experiences that we're bringing into this space, but none of us knows everything. None of us has seen everything. And so really wanting to learn from other people who come in with different identities and different experiences and honor their experience rather than trying to act like we have all the answers. And that's especially important for me as a facilitator. Because I'm also very much in this journey myself. I have experience working in trying to create inclusive environmental education spaces and training others in doing the same. And I've also made a ton of mistakes throughout all of that. And I'm still working through how best to train, how best to teach. So I think that open mind and humility is really key. Listening deeply and for understanding, others might call it active listening, but not listening just to respond, listening to really try and learn something and hear someone else's perspective and experience. Assuming good intentions, I think is important. We definitely want to understand that this is tough. We might not have all the language we need to have these conversations. We might say something that someone else takes offense at. And it's important to make room for that, to be brave, to be a little bit messy. As Rebecca, you said in the chat, being willing to try and fail maybe. But the other side of that is really important is attending to impact as well. So recognizing that even if we didn't intend to harm someone or make them feel unsafe, if they say that is the case, not getting defensive right away, but really trying to open that conversation up and understand where they're coming from with that. Respecting confidentiality, otherwise known as the Vegas rule, what happens here stays here. Take learnings away, but don't take people's stories if they've shared something vulnerable. So this is a safe space for that. Take space, make space. This one, if you're someone who tends to get into the conversation really quickly and has no trouble speaking up, maybe be conscious of that and take a step back, and vice versa. If you're someone who maybe doesn't participate as vocally typically, I encourage you to step into that space. And then finally, expect unfinished business. This is a lifelong process. We're all going to be continuing to work on this throughout our careers. and with our instructors, we would say throughout the season, this is something we're gonna keep talking about and working through. We're not gonna figure out how to be inclusive instructors in a 3-hour session and be perfect at it all the time. So there's going to be some loose ends. So those are, again, that's kind of how I would give some of that spiel to instructors. I think these are also good guidelines for our time together as well. I'm curious if anyone has any others that they really like to use when they're creating these kind of spaces for discussions around race or identity. Feel free to either pop it in the chat, or Rebecca, can they unmute themselves? Or do I have to?
If I can. I have permission for everybody to unmute yourself, and then, you know, if you forget to remute yourself, then I might, you know, go in and do that for you if you just forget.
Cool. Yeah, so feel free to unmute yourself and jump in if you have anything you would want to add to this, or any questions or yeah, comments there. Yeah, I like that, Nick, specifically recognizing that you might come in with an idea that doesn't line up. Not just openness to other perspectives, but openness to actually listening to them and changing it. That's a great question, Kate, and I will get to that in just a second. I'll kind of give you a little bit of a breakdown at least. All right. Well, in the interest of time, I'm gonna plan to move on, but if I could just get, oh, nice, there we go. So creating a safe space for sharing, and I think that one's interesting. There's been some pushback against the use of the term safe, just because I can't necessarily say that this space is safe for someone else who maybe doesn't share my identity. But we can create a safe enough space, and we can create a space where we're really truly listening to students or participants. And so if they say they're unsafe, I'm going to respond to that, rather than telling them that this is a safe space. Yeah, exactly, Matt. Brave space is a good term, and that also puts the just recognizes that it takes bravery to be vulnerable and to share and to put yourself out there in that way. So that kind of puts that responsibility on the students in some ways. Yeah, and then avoiding defensiveness for sure. So unless anyone has any objectives, we're gonna kind of use these as our agreements for the rest of our 25 minutes together here today. And I'm going to post them in the chat. I think it is really important to have them present and visible, so that, sorry, I got lost in the chat there, so that we can return to them, and so that they can be something that grounds our time together. So another thing that I think is really an important piece of inclusive instruction, and just instruction in general, is giving students some sort of roadmap, right? Like especially for some of our students who are coming maybe from Oakland or from Providence, Rhode Island, like being in Yellowstone might be a profoundly uncomfortable experience for them, not just because of the lack of noise, the lack of just the lack of people in some ways, and specifically the lack of people that look like them in and around the park. It's really important to have some sort of foundation of knowledge, and just really clear expectations where they know something. They know, like, okay, I know what's coming next. I know what's expected of me in this space. That can go a long way towards creating a strong inclusive group culture, and towards helping students feel safe and comfortable in what might be an uncomfortable environment. And the other big piece of that is relationships, as we talked about before. But so So this is generally the training outline that we use with our instructors. And so we have some group agreements, we create that container, we start to create relationships with one another. We've already done some of that work generally in training at this point. We talk about what inclusivity is and why it matters. So we have a common language, common definition. And that's something that we're going to do next, is we are going to have a little bit of conversation about inclusivity. We spend a fair amount of time working on our own identities and coming into a self-awareness of what, how those identities affect us as educators, as teachers, and how those identities might be seen or perceived by our students or by our peers. So that critical self-reflection is one of the foundations of this work as well. And I'm going to show you a couple tools related to that. We won't really dive into that too much as a group today. And likewise with identity and bias. So that's kind of that next step is like, okay, so we have all of these students and instructors coming onto course with all of these identities and all of these experiences. What sort of issues might that create? What sort of barriers might there be for students to feel safe and to feel like that's an inclusive environment? And so we'll talk about a couple of the main concepts that we work on there. And then with instructors, we have this inclusive instruction worksheet that's adapted from some Avarna group resources, as well as University of Michigan teaching resources. And we have them reflect on it and look at it and look at, okay, what are some of these strategies that I feel really comfortable in? What are some that are new to me that I want to try out? And then they have that checklist with them throughout the rest of their season, and they can take it beyond that as well and continue to kind of work on those different pieces. And then we have a closing. And so where we're going to focus today is really on this kind of what is inclusivity and why does it matter piece. If we have time, we might dive in a little bit more to the identity and bias, but we may not have time for that. So I may just kind of go through and show some tools and talk about some of the ways that we would use those with instructors. So let me just check where I am. Okay, awesome. So if folks who are in the session that just happened about coded language, remember the presenter used a Padlet, so we're going to use that again as well. And so I'm going to drop a link in the chat, and I'm going to ask you all to go there, and we're just going to take a couple minutes. And the question that you're responding to is what is inclusive instruction? Like, what does that look like for you? You can give examples of how to instruct inclusively. You can give just other words that you think of when you think of inclusivity. So just anything that comes to mind when you, where's that chat? Anything that comes to mind when you think of inclusive instruction. And so that's the link, and we'll just take a couple minutes, and I will share that Padlet so we can all see it coming up. Yeah, so definitely not assuming anything about our students before they're coming in, trying to let them define what their experience is, and not assuming a baseline comfort. Yeah, I think that's one that we fall into a lot, just in that most of our instructional staff are come from a specific background and have experience and comfort being in the outdoors and in outdoor spaces, and that's that's why we hire them, but that can also be a limitation for sure. Student agency, I really like that. Yeah, that's talking about that asset-based instruction as well. Focus on curiosity. Yeah, we're looking for students to develop higher level thinking and also be able to share their experience in a way that they then feel heard and validated, rather than feeling like we're asking for a specific answer that maybe isn't true for their experience. And that's part of that deep listening too. Call in, call out. Yeah, I like that too. And that speaks to the interrupting piece of inclusive instruction too, right? If someone says something that is offensive or does something that isn't appropriate, that we're using that as an educational moment and trying to help them learn from it, rather than getting their defenses up by calling them out. This isn't letting me update it anymore, but I think, yeah, there's a ton of great answers on here. I wish I could get to all of them. What I'm learning from this, though, is that inclusive instruction is incredibly multifaceted and complex. And there's no one thing that you need to do to create inclusive culture and an inclusive classroom. That a lot of it is about, I'm seeing a lot around here around like self-awareness and awareness of your own assumptions and what you're coming into this with. I'm also seeing a lot in here around, yeah, around just awareness. And I think that's a big piece, is just having an awareness of the group culture, trying to get to know students on a really personal and relational basis, so that they feel safe talking to you about maybe what they're feeling unsafe about, or just sharing their identity. And then responding if you're seeing something or feeling something in that group that isn't inclusive, or if you're doing something in that group that is excluding certain students. And I think I like this. I'll just say this last one before I stop sharing, and you can feel free to keep adding to this. This is great. I guess the other thing that I'm getting from this is that you all know what inclusive instruction is, which is awesome that we have that much shared knowledge in this room right now, and just great to see that this isn't a new concept for people at all. So I'm gonna stop sharing, and we'll go back to the PowerPoint real quick. But I liked what someone said about subtle ways of showing allyship. And I think that one of the things that makes me think of as well is just the that most of the, or a lot of the ways in which, especially environmental education, I think spaces are exclusive of people of color, of disabled people, or temporarily disabled people, of any of these non-dominant groups. Oftentimes it is really subtle, the ways in which that happens, and it's something that is very much baked into the culture of environmental education and the culture of being outdoors in general, and spending time outdoors in our at least our US context. And so a lot of this is about unlearning and learning how to notice those subtleties, and then to address them, whether that's subtly, that can be really powerful if you're just validating maybe a student who needs that validation, who you've noticed hasn't been getting it from the rest of the group, but it can also be explicit and non-subtle as well. And I think those are both strategies. But it starts with the noticing and awareness. So we'll kind of breeze through this. This is again from that University of Michigan College of Literature, Science and Arts Inclusive Teaching Initiative, which I'll have a link for that at the end too. They have a lot of great resources. I think the things I want to highlight here are just that inclusive instruction is not just about instruction. Instruction is part of it, but it's also about design of that program and of the curriculum. It's about assessment is a huge piece of it, figuring out ways to assess that are culturally relevant and that are at the appropriate level of challenge. Assessing often as well, making sure that you're intervening early if students aren't understanding expectations or content. And then this piece here, that it's teaching that attends to students' different social identities and backgrounds. So I think it's really important when we talk about inclusive instruction. Again, this gets back to that identity piece, that that we're teaching in a way that is conscious of race, that is conscious of difference, that's not trying to invisibilize these different identities and experiences that we bring with us on course. And that's not in the sense like we don't want to create rigid boundaries between students based on different identities. And we also don't want to make assumptions about them based on the visible identities that we see. But it's in the sense of understanding and acknowledging that those differences matter, that our students who are coming from another culture or another state or a different community are going to be facing a very different educational environment than, say, a group of white students who's coming from Gardner, Montana. And that we need to be teaching in a way that's conscious of that, that's intentional and relevant to and inclusive of those students' diverse experiences. And if we're not being intentional about being inclusive, we're being intentional about being exclusive, because so many of the dominant ways that we think about teaching and we think about these sort of programs are actually exclusive, even if they feel race neutral or just generally neutral to us. And so paying attention to difference is actually a big piece of that. Principles, yeah, so we kind of got into a lot of these. It's a lot about relationships. It's a lot about asset-based thinking rather than deficit thinking, not making assumptions, allowing students to speak for themselves, and really creating that space where every voice really is heard. And then this, I guess we haven't really talked about providing windows as well as mirrors. That's the content piece, right? So providing students not only with windows into other ways of thinking or other experiences, but also with mirrors that reflect their own experience, that make them feel comfortable, that are relevant to who they are. So this is getting into now, with our last 5 minutes, kind of how we, some of the tools that we use to get into these conversations with our instructors. And the first one is this identity wheel. And so this is, again, adapted from that University of Michigan site. And we spend a lot of time with instructors thinking about their own identities, thinking about how those show up as an educator, how those maybe don't show up as an educator, which ones others prioritize and place importance on, which ones they prioritize and place importance on. And the goal of this is really to understand just the diversity and multiplicity that we all have within ourselves, and complexity, and to start to be able to extrapolate to, okay, if that's happening in here, and I'm not always aware of how those things are interacting, there's a whole lot of messy stuff going on in the classroom. And that's the fun of teaching. That's the fun of convening a group of students and taking them to a new place and exposing them to new ideas. And that's also the challenge, is that all of us have our own blinders, our own places where we don't have the experience to be able to speak to that, or maybe even to be aware of what's going on in a certain group dynamic. And so becoming aware of our own unawarenesses, I think, is kind of the first step, and one of the things that we dive into a lot here. We then spend a fair amount of time talking about bias, and the idea that bias isn't just like I am prejudiced against someone. Bias doesn't live in our brains; it lives and breathes in our bodies. And so this is really deep work to try and notice when we see a bias, when we see ourselves slipping into, say, deficit thinking around maybe a student who's coming from Oakland, for example, and who's Black, and recognizing that, okay, that's deficit thinking, that's a bias that I have in my body. What can I do then to counteract that? And how is that showing up in the group as well? Again, with biases, we also talk about microaggressions, which are those subtle ways in which spaces are exclusive, even if we're not being intentionally exclusive or discriminatory by any means. And there's a whole lot of literature on that. There's a whole lot of literature on all of this. That's kind of one of the challenges, I think, of teaching inclusive instruction, is that there's a lot of rabbit holes to go down. And they're not rabbit holes. They're very important places that we need to be spending work and spending time doing the work, reading the literature, reflecting on our own experience. But there's just a lot. So I think we really start with your own identity and that awareness. And then we move into these assessment tools. And I'll show you here, I'll stop sharing real quick and just show you what those look like. Because once we've talked about identity, then we start to talk about then we want to and like problems that can come up, of course. Then we want to obviously focus on strategies that we can use to reduce those potential issues, and to interrupt behaviors that are exclusive or are damaging to the group and to student learning. And so this is the Avarna group's instructor bias checklist. And so this is just a good thing for instructors to kind of look at and think about the subtle ways, again, that bias can come in. So what examples / illustrations can I use to connect the key concept to participants' lives? Thinking explicitly about how can I change the content or the activities in a way that's going to be more inclusive. Making sure that we're creating an open environment where there's shared voice and everyone has an opportunity to talk. Noticing patterns where there's not participation or where there is disengagement, and addressing those and intervening those early on. So there's a ton of great stuff in here. The other one that I mentioned, I don't know if I can get to there we go. Okay.
Alexei, there's a question in the chat about giving examples of how we can shift our assessments to be more inclusive.
Yeah, let me see. I had something talking about that. I mean, so I think one of the main ways that I think about that. So the first off is having a lot of informal assessment at the beginning to understand where students are at with the content, as well as just like, hey, how are you feeling? With comfort level, with fed level, all of those sort of assessments, kind of soft assessments, rather than like, did you learn the content sort of assessments. And then I think the other main thing in terms of more like, actual content assessment, the two things that come to mind there are just lost my train of thought, sorry. Are one, holding students to high expectations and the second one is making those expectations really clear and transparent. I think one of the ways that bias often shows up in education is that deficit mindset around students of color. In that, like, okay, we need to adapt this because they're not going to be able to understand these concepts, or they're not going to be able to reach this level in the same way. And oftentimes that happens really unconsciously. There's all sorts of studies of people reading essays of students of color, like with the name and without the name attached to it, and giving much less helpful critical feedback when they assume that is a student of color. And it's coming from this place of oftentimes of not wanting to seem prejudiced, and wanting to like show that you aren't prejudiced against that student. But it can still have damaging effects. So I think holding students to all the same expectations, holding those high expectations, and being transparent about what they're being tested on and what they're being assessed for are big ones. Here, I'll go to my last slide real quick, and then maybe if we can make 5 minutes for questions or so.
Well, we're 5 minutes over, so
we're over already.
You know,
okay.
Anything to wrap up? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Well, so this is just a list of resources that we use. Again, I think the main tools that we use are that identity wheel, and then the Avarna group has a lot of great resources. So that inclusive instruction checklist is a really great one. And then Learning for Justice is another one that I'll highlight there. They used to be called Teaching Tolerance. They have recently rebranded themselves, which is great. But they have a ton of great resources, and this Speak Up at School one is especially good for interrupting exclusive behaviors and kind of looking at different ways of calling people in or calling people out if necessary. So yeah, I really appreciate everyone joining me today. Yeah, I know that was a lot and a whirlwind. Yeah, I hope that there were some interesting tools or pieces that you're gonna take away and hopefully try to implement in your own programs and your own teaching.
Thank you. Yeah, so we are getting to our lunch and learn convo, and I saw Ryan come in. Ryan, would you be willing to start in 10 minutes from now so that folks can go grab their lunch to have a lunch and learn? And in the meantime, Alexei, thank you so much for your time and for your great insight. Lots of good teasers and lots of good things to look more into in that presentation.